Hi everyone, this is Monica, one of the designers with the Ornament Girl, and today we're going to be making these adorable little patchwork pumpkins. I could just imagine a bowl filled with these on your table during the fall season or during Halloween. So let's get started by talking about the foam that you'll need to create these. We're going to be using a disc-shaped type of foam for this pattern. As you can see, it's sort of an oval type of shape, so the width of the circle here is about 3¼ inches wide. And then if you turn it to the side here, the depth of it is about 1¾ inches. You could probably take this same idea though and utilize other shapes of foam. In fact, we based this basic idea off of the Moonlight pattern, which is a free pattern that is available on the Ornament Girl website. In fact, I used the Moonlight pattern to create this 6-paneled ball. And so, like I said, we took that idea and we just adapted it for this disc shape. So if you're interested in getting the step-by-step instructions in an ebook form and the video by the Ornament Girl, you can go to the website. You'll find the link below, and you can try out the Moonlight pattern for yourself. So as I mentioned, this disc shape is available in the Ornament Girl supply shop. There is another brand that has a shape somewhat similar to this, the Smooth Foam brand, and that type of foam is very, very dense, whereas the custom-made foam that is available in the Ornament Girl shop is a softer type of foam. So if you happen to be using this for making quilted ornaments, it's not quite so hard on your fingers. If you are going to be using this disc shape from the Ornament Girl supply shop, then you can also utilize this printable. This is free on the Ornament Girl website. There's a link for it down below. And you can print this out and cut out these templates that are available here. One of them will help you to mark your foam in the correct way. And then there are a couple of templates that will help you in cutting your fabric pieces so that they will fit properly on your foam. So go ahead and download that and print it out. Make sure when you print it that you read the instructions here. You need to print it at 100%. You don't want to use any settings that would shrink it. So make sure that when you print it out, you measure this box over here. It should measure 1 inch by 1 inch, and if it does, then you know you've printed it at the correct size. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these out, and then we will get started and talk about the other supplies that you'll need. Okay, I have all of my templates cut out. One is going to be used for marking my foam in just a moment, and then the other two will be used for cutting my fabric pieces. Regarding the fabrics that you'll want to use for this type of ornament, when you're first starting out, I really suggest you stick with cotton quilting fabrics or cotton blend type fabrics because they're the easiest to work with. Like I said, especially when you're learning, it's just easier to use something that's not going to be too slippery or too thick. I really suggest avoiding super thick fabrics like burlap or upholstery fabrics, something like that that's going to be super thick and difficult to tuck down into the grooves. Now, something like satin type fabrics, those are beautiful on these types of ornaments, but they can be a little more challenging because they slip around a little bit. So starting out, like I said, with something that's more of a cotton quilting type of fabric is probably best. But once you're acquainted with the basic techniques, it's great to start branching out and trying other types of fabrics. For instance, I created more of a Christmas ornament design using a velvet type of fabric, and that was a little more challenging because it was a little thicker, but the results were really beautiful. Also, on one of these Moonlight 6-panel type of ornaments, I used a very thick brocade type of fabric. It was, once again, a little trickier to work with because it was so thick, and trying to tuck it down into those grooves was more of a challenge, but the result was so beautiful. So like I said, once you start out and you learn those basic techniques with easier fabrics, then branch out and try something that's just a little more challenging. So you will need to decide which fabrics you want for the center panel and for the side panels on your pumpkin. You can do both sides the same, like I have done here, or you could certainly mix and match things and make your two sides on your pumpkin different. So I want my pumpkin that I'm making to be the same on both sides. So I'm cutting 2 of this football shaped template out of this pattern here. So I have 2 pieces here. These fabric pieces are 2½ inches wide by 5 inches long. And the same goes for this one down here. I'm cutting 4 pieces with this crescent shaped template, and there are 2 different fabrics here. I have 2 different ones. And I've just stacked them all together because I'm going to use this template to cut them all at the same time. And once again, these are 2½ by 5 inch pieces. One thing that's important that you'll need to think about for this ornament is some sort of a trim. Now, this style of ornament does not involve folding and pinning fabric to a foam base like most of the patterns on the Ornament Girl website. This style is a tucked fabric type of ornament, also referred to as Kimekomi ornaments. So it involves just taking that fabric piece and laying it flat on the foam and then tucking it on the sides here into some grooves that we're going to make in the foam here in just a moment. So because we'll have those grooves with possibly some fabric edges kind of sticking out, we need to cover those. And so some sort of trim will help to do that. Now on a regular moonlight pattern, which is the ball that I showed you earlier, I often like to use a little bit of a wider trim because it's a little more forgiving. It covers up any mistakes that you might make in those grooves, and if you have something that's sort of sticking out a little bit, some wide trim will help cover that. But I really don't like to use too wide of trim on these little delicate discs, because if you use something that's really wide, especially here on the edge, you're going to lose some of the definition. And also, because it comes in close here, it's rounded here on the edges. If you have a really wide trim, it might overhang just a little bit. So it's not going to conform to the shape of that disc very well. It might just sort of stick out on the sides and not hug that ornament. So I like to use something a little thinner, usually something 2 or 3 millimeters wide. So there are a lot of different options out there. You can use something like this, which is like a twisted cord type of trim, or you can use a satin rat tail type of cord, or any kind of like a plastic canvas cord. In fact, here's one that I did that was a star shape, and I used plastic canvas cord. So there's a certain type of yarn that is often used for plastic canvas crafting, and often it has little metallic threads in there, and I really like to use that. So that's another option you might look for in your local craft store, canvas cord, and it gives you some really beautiful results. So look around and find something that you feel like will give you enough coverage but won't overhang the edges here on the side. For one patchwork pumpkin ornament, you're going to need somewhere around 28 to 30 inches of your trim in order to go around all the edges and everything. You're going to need a little more than that if you also want to use it to create a hanger for your pumpkin. Now, I usually opt for no hanger on mine because either I'm going to be setting it down like in a bowl or something, and I'll create just a little stem. If I do want to hang it, I'll find some sort of a pin like an upholstery pin or something that has a little round loop at the top, so that I can hang it up. In fact, this one here I got in the Ornament Girl supply shop, and it has the perfect size little loop there so that you can take a hanger or some string or whatever and place it right through there, and then you'll be able to hang your ornament that way. So that little loop comes in really handy. Like I said, you can find a few different colors of these currently in the Ornament Girl supply shop, so check those out. If you don't want to have a loop of any kind at the top of your pumpkin, you could certainly do any kind of combination of long pins, perhaps a corsage pin, and some beads or some bead caps. For instance, these cone-shaped bead caps are really nice because they give you a little extra height, or you could stack some beads on there. You'll also need to keep in mind that the top of your ornament is going to have some ends of the string that need to be covered. So having any kind of bead cap or something that's a little larger here right at the base will really help in covering up some of those things that you don't want to be seen on your finished pumpkin. If you want to have the look of tendrils at the top of your pumpkin, then you can use any kind of crafting wire that you have available. In fact, this one here that I used on this pumpkin was just brown floral wire, and I just wrapped it around a small paintbrush that I happen to have handy in order to give me those loops. You can also create a bow of some sort, which is what I did here with this velvety type of rickrack looking ribbon, and I'm going to place that at the top of the pumpkin that I create today. So again, there's lots of options. It just kind of depends on what you feel like goes with the fabric and with the look of the pumpkin that you want to create. There are some important tools you're going to need to make this ornament. First, you're going to need something to cut your foam with, and then you're going to need something to tuck the fabric into the grooves that you make on the foam. So to cut your foam, you can use something like an X-Acto knife, which I don't have an example of right here, but you can use an X-Acto knife. Those work really well, or some sort of a craft knife like this that's retractable. But if you're going to be making a lot of these, I highly recommend that you invest in a hot knife. So a hot knife, you plug it in and turn it on, and it gets very, very hot here at the tip. You don't want to touch this part of it, and it will melt your foam like butter. It works really well. But some people aren't comfortable with that, especially if you don't have a really steady hand. You may want to be more inclined to use an X-Acto knife or craft knife because, you know, once that tip touches the foam, it's going to melt it instantly. So just be really careful working with these, but they really are worth their weight if you plan on making lots of these ornaments. I mean, because it saves you so much time. So they work great if you think that you are confident enough to use it and you have a steady hand. Now, once you have those grooves cut into your foam, you're going to need something to help tuck the fabric in there. So I highly recommend the Ornament Girl fabric tucking tool. These are great. This helps really get that fabric down into the grooves in such a way that it's not going to, go anywhere once it's down in there. But you can certainly use something like a thin butter knife, or I know some people like to use upholstery pins, something to shove that fabric down into the grooves. You'll also need some scissors. I like to use a couple different kinds. First, I like to use fabric scissors for cutting my fabric pieces. And I also like to use some sort of snippy little scissors, some smaller scissors that can really get down in there and really trim away that extra fabric once it's been tucked into the grooves of the ornament. Sometimes little bits and pieces of the fabric will stick up out of the grooves, and you really want to get down close and snip off as much as you can so that the trim, when it's placed on top, it doesn't have a whole lot of excess to cover. So some smaller scissors will come in handy. Something else that is very, very important, you're going to need some sort of glue in order to glue the trim down on your ornament. The trim, especially right here, will sometimes try to pop out of the groove if it's not glued down. So very important to find something that is tacky, but also clear just in case it kind of squishes out as you place your trim on there. If it dries and it's not clear, then it's going to be really obvious. So once again, this is my favorite one to use. You could also use something like Beacon 3-in-1 glue or whatever your favorite clear drying craft glue might be. I also like to keep a glue stick on hand, and this is just sort of personal preference, but I like to use a glue stick as I place each individual panel just to sort of hold my fabric in place while I'm tucking the edges of it, because I found that I kind of struggled with having those panels of fabric slip around on me while I was working. So just a little bit of use of the glue stick, and that seemed to solve that problem for me. So maybe you'll find that helpful too. Well, I lied. There's actually one more thing that you will need in order to do this pattern, and that's a few straight pins. And that's because that's what we're going to use in order to hold our template on our foam. So just a few straight pins will help do the job. You're going to start with one and take your foam marking template, and there's a dot right in the middle of it, and just place that right through the dot. And that is the very center of the template. And we're going to be placing that right here in the middle of the disc. Now, one side of your disc is just plain, it's flat, and if you look at the other side, there happens to be a hole right in the middle, and so that's the very center of the disc. And if you look carefully, you can just eyeball it and place that pin directly in the center of that hole. So try to be careful, don't go to one side or the other, just try to get it right in the very middle and go straight down. So our template is now centered on our disc, and we're just going to smooth it down one way, and the tip of it is going to come up here and meet the edge of that disc. There's a bit of a line there that is created during the manufacturing process, and somewhere along that line hopefully is where the tip of your template matches up with, and we're just going to pin it right in place. And now turn to the other side and do the same thing, just flatten it straight down, and right there at the tip place another pin. So you'll notice it's not laying flat absolutely 100% right against the foam. It's sticking up just a little bit, but that's because our disc is a little bit curved. So that's to be expected. It's not going to lay perfectly. Now, if it makes you feel a little more comfortable before you draw some lines on here, you can go ahead and smooth that out on the sides too and pin the sides. But I think mine's, it's sitting good enough and close enough that I should be able to draw my lines without having any trouble. So now I'm ready to draw some lines. If you don't want to draw some lines, you can certainly just use like a pin or maybe your tucking tool, and you can just score the line instead of drawing it. I'm going to go ahead and draw it because I want you to be able to see it really well on camera. So just carefully follow the edges of your template. And remember, it may not be absolutely perfect. Just try to get it, as close to matching the template edges as you can. All right, so I have this side done, and now I'm going to take this out, all the pins, and I'm going to turn my disc over to the opposite side. And even though we don't know where the very center is on this side, that's okay, because we have those top marks at the top and the bottom, and we're just going to match up with those. So lay it over the disc so that the top and the bottom points match up with the opposite side that you already drew, and pin the edges in place, smoothing it down right against the foam. And I'm going to go ahead and place that center pin anyway, just to kind of hold it in place so it doesn't slip around. And now draw more lines right along the edge of your template once again. All right, our lines are drawn on both sides. I can remove the template. So now we can cut the grooves into our foam. I'm going to be using the hot knife in order to create these cuts, but as I mentioned before, you can use an X-Acto knife or some sort of a craft knife in order to get the same result. This is just going to go a little faster because the hot knife cuts so quickly. So as I mentioned before, be very, very careful about using this. You know, you probably don't want to use this with children or pets around. Be very careful. Don't touch it anywhere where it shouldn't be because you might end up melting something or injuring yourself. So I'm going to get started here at one of the spots along the edge of the disc where those template marks overlap a little bit. You'll notice that they're not perfect. That's okay. We're just kind of wanting the general spot of where those crisscross. So to get started, like I said, I'm going to get started here, and I'm just going to make a mark sort of centering it where those two crisscross marks overlap if it was just a straight line. So I'm going to go about right here, and I'm going to go about, just somewhere around 1/8 of an inch, maybe just a little over 1/8 of an inch down into the foam. You don't want to go too deep, because if you make your cut too deep, it may end up getting actually too wide as well, as it just continues to melt. And if your groove is too wide, then your fabric might not stay down in there. So I only went down about 1/8 of an inch, maybe just a smidge more than that. So now that I have the groove started, that's going to give me a place to begin with my knife as I create this first curve down this side of the disc. Now, something else you want to be aware of is try to keep your knife straight and not really moving to the right or to the left too much. If you lean your knife too much, it once again is going to make that groove that you're making, the cut, too wide at the top, and then your trim might not cover it completely. So you don't want this really wide groove here at the top, and then as it goes down into the foam, it gets more narrow. You want to kind of keep it all the same width. So I'm going to try really hard to keep my knife somewhat perpendicular to the surface of the foam, and that hopefully will give me a really thin groove and not a groove that's really melted out very widely. So I'm just going to follow that curve around, only going in about 1/8 of an inch down to the bottom, and then I'm stopping. Okay, I think that thickness is pretty good. If you feel like there's a spot where maybe you didn't go down far enough, you could certainly go back and just retrace your steps and go down a little further. Now remember, this disc is somewhat thin, so if you go straight into the foam and you go down really far with your knife, you're possibly going to meet that same spot when you're doing the opposite side, and you might break off some of the foam. So don't go down too far. About 1/8 of an inch or so is perfectly fine. And now I'm turning it over, and I'm going to do this opposite side. Once again, I'm going to start here at the top and just make a little mark, crisscross. And now I have a spot where I can begin, and I'm going to follow that line, keeping my knife somewhat perpendicular to the surface of the foam as I drag it down that line and then come up. All right, so one side is done. Now I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing here on this side. And now that our center grooves are done, now we're going to do a groove all along the edge of our disc. So just follow that edge. Once again, you don't want to go too far down, just about the same amount that you did before, just 1/8 of an inch or maybe just a tad more than that. All right, all of our cuts are done, and let's get started placing our fabric on the foam. So I have taken those fabric cutting templates and pinned them onto my fabric pieces. Remember, for template number 1, you want 2 pieces of fabric, whatever those colors are, and these will become the center panels on each side of your disc. So do the same thing here with the crescent shaped one, but you want 4 pieces for that one. And once again, you can just pin it in place so that as you cut it, it won't slip around on you. All right, my fabric pieces are cut out. I'm just removing those templates from them, and now we can begin placing these on the foam. All right, so I have my first 3 pieces for side number 1 laid out. I like to lay them out in order so I kind of get a feel for how they're going to look and which order I want to do them in. I tend to find that if I do the side pieces first and then finish with the center piece, then it seems like the edges seem to stay in a little better. Now that's just my personal preference. You're welcome to do it however. So I'm going to get started with this side and then do the other side and then finish up with the center here. So since I'm doing one of the sides first, I'm going to move those out of the way. So you can see right away that as I lay this piece here on the side, that the fabric, it overhangs quite a bit, and we do that purposely. We wanted to give you enough fabric to make sure that you had enough to tuck into those grooves. Now you are going to have to do some extra trimming, and I don't know about you, but I really would prefer to do a little extra trimming than not have enough fabric to cover everything, especially if you're working with a fabric that might be just a little more stretchy. Sometimes those fabrics, as you tuck them in, they kind of move around on you, and you may end up with one spot that you don't quite have enough fabric to tuck into the groove and you have to rearrange. So we didn't want you to have to fight it too much. We'd rather have you trim and not have to fight it than just have to untuck and retuck and fight it because you have one spot where you just don't have enough fabric to cover it. So if you don't like having quite so much to have to trim off, then, you know, go ahead and cut your pieces out, but cut them just a little bit smaller than what the original template has. So for me, this works, and I'm going to go ahead and place this piece, but first I'm going to take my handy dandy little glue stick here. Remember, I told you this is sort of just my personal preference. You don't have to do it this way. You can just get started by placing your fabric on there and then starting to tuck it. But I really like to add some glue. Now, as I add this glue onto my foam, I'm really careful about not getting it into a different section than the one I'm working in. I really try to watch those edges because I don't want the fabric to try to attach to a different panel. I just want to keep it all in this area. So I'm really careful about where my glue stick is going. So I usually try to start by getting the edges first, and then I'll kind of fill in the middle areas. All right. You can't see it obviously because it's just clear. Next time I think I'll have to use the kind that goes on purple and dries clear so you can see it a little easier on camera. But for now, we've got this started. It's all glued, and I'm going to lay this piece, just center it right over that section. Now I'm going to start here in the middle and just kind of rub it down so that it will stick to the glue and kind of smooth it out. You'll notice I have a little bit of buckling here along the edges, and that's to be expected because it's not, you know, perfectly rounded like the foam is. Now I purposely went over and beyond that groove line that I had cut. And that's because you need to have just a little excess beyond the cut line so that it will tuck into the groove when you use your tucking tool. So now that I've got it kind of in place, I'm going to go ahead and start using my tucking tool and getting it down into the groove. Now, everybody has their own method and what works best for them. I like to kind of work a little bit back and forth. That way, you know, it seems to go in a little easier and you're not pulling the fabric one direction so much so that it pulls away and you don't have any fabric left on the opposite side. So I'm going to first of all just kind of do a first run through here and kind of find where that groove is and just do like an initial tuck. I'm not doing this as like my final tuck. I just kind of want to get a feel for where is that groove. And if you find that one side of your tucking tool is a little too thick, you can always move to this sharper side and that will help out. Okay, so that's about where my groove is on that side, so that helps. But now I'm not really sure where it's at here. I can kind of feel it, but I want to try to find it. Okay, there it is. You can see that my fabric's trying to go down in there. So I'm doing a little bit on one side, a little bit on the other side, just as my initial tuck. All right, so I'm getting a much better feel for where that is. If you find, like right here, you can notice I have a little buckle here. I'll just kind of pull it out a little bit, and you can use one side or the other and just kind of try to smooth that fabric out and then tuck it again. So nothing says that once it's tucked, you can't untuck it and retuck it. Okay, that's a pretty good tuck. I'm going to take my small scissors now and just trim away some of that excess fabric so it's not in the way. Make sure as you trim that you're not cutting something you shouldn't. You don't want to have to start from scratch because you accidentally cut something that shouldn't have been. Here toward the top, you'll notice that it's going to be a little tricky because you have a lot of pieces that are meeting up right here. And if you have too much fabric excess, it's going to start getting bulky here. So it's kind of a little bit of a balancing act. You do want to trim closely so you don't have all kinds of excess fabric that shouldn't be there. But you don't want to accidentally trim so close that suddenly you have a big chunk missing right there. So, you know, it might take you a few tries to get it exactly where you want it and get it trimmed enough so that it's not going to wreak havoc when 6 pieces are meeting up right there. This is where those little bitty scissors, especially some with sharp tips, can really come in handy because they can kind of get down in those little spots and crevices so you can get a pretty close snip and remove things that are just going to be in the way later. All right, so I think I've trimmed pretty much close as I can. I'm going to do a final tuck and try to get those edges down into the grooves. As I'm doing this final tuck, you'll notice that I am using the sharper side of this tucking tool because sometimes the foam where I cut it initially with the hot knife just doesn't seem quite deep enough for how far I need to tuck this fabric. So I'll use the tip of it to create a little more of a groove down in there so that I can tuck the fabric just a little further down. Now you don't want to get too rough with the foam because, you know, it is going to break on you if you're too rough with it. But sometimes just a little extra poking with the end of that tucking tool will be just the right amount so that you can get that fabric a little further down in there. So that side looks like it's really nice and tucked. And I'm going to do the same thing here on this side. And then we will move on to our next piece. I'm really paying attention and being very gentle as I work up here toward the top because we do have those 6 cuts that are coming together and meeting. So the foam is a little more fragile right there. So don't get super rough with it here toward the top. In fact, it's a little better to just work slowly and to get your fabric in there a little at a time, just working slowly instead of really trying to shove it down in there and then your foam ends up breaking or some of the corners of those different sections break off. All right, there we go. My first fabric piece is nice and tucked in the grooves, and I'm going to move on to piece number 2. All right, here we go. We're going to do the second panel over here on this right side. And so before we place it on there, I'm going to use my same little trick as before with my glue stick and just run my glue stick all along this one segment that I'm going to be working in, being very careful to try to not get any glue in the neighboring sections. Okay, and now I'm going to take my piece of fabric and I'm just going to center it right over that section, making sure that the edges of my fabric do overlap that groove in the foam just a little bit so that I have enough to tuck down in there. All right, now let's find those edges where the grooves are. We're just going to work gently and just do sort of an initial tuck to try to get our bearings here. As I start working here toward the top or the bottom where the segment gets thinner and thinner, sometimes I get a little bit lost. I feel like my tucking tool wants to go one way and my brain wants it to go that way, but the actual groove is another way. So like I said, work gently, work carefully. You don't want to break off part of your foam. That is a really good initial tuck. All right, so now I'm taking my small little scissors and I'm going to go ahead and run it along these edges to just get some of that excess fabric off of there. We don't want too much excess fabric that we're going to have to tuck down there later. As I did some of that trimming, some of my fabric came a little bit untucked, but I was really careful not to trim off too much there when I saw that it came untucked, so I'm just going to tuck it right back in there. And now I'm going to go ahead and try to do this final tuck where I get all those edges further down in the groove. I might need to do just a little extra trimming right here toward the top, but I'll take care of that in a minute. Right here at the top, I do feel like I have a little bit too much fabric that I'm trying to get down in the groove, so I'm going to trim the end of it just a little bit, being careful not to take a big chunk out of the part that needs to cover the actual segment. I love these little snippy scissors with the sharp tips on them because I can get right down in there right where I want to trim, and I can't do that with my large dressmaker shears. All right, that's much better. I'm going to do the same thing up here on this side. That's a little too much fabric to try to tuck down in there, I feel like, so I'm going to trim it just a little closer. Get some of those pieces out of there. There we go. And then tuck it down a little more. All right, second panel is done, and now let's work on the center panel. So here we go. One of the center panels is going to go right in the middle. So let's once again start with our trusty glue stick here. Well, you don't have to use it if you don't want to. I just prefer to use it. So I'm going to be really careful now because I really don't want this glue to get over on the fabric that I've already done. So I'm just kind of tilting my glue stick to the side to try to get up there at the tip of that segment without getting glue all over those other sections. All right, now center that fabric piece, the one that looks like a football, right in the middle, and then kind of smooth it outward from the center so that you don't have any lumps or bumps. Now it's not going to lay perfectly flat, but almost. It should conform pretty well to the flat disc because, you know, these discs are not quite as rounded as a round ball, so it's a little easier in some respects when you're doing this center panel than it is on a ball. All right, so now we need to do our initial tuck just to try to find those grooves. So I'm going to kind of work one side and then the other side. It's probably a little harder to see on camera what I'm doing with this darker fabric, but if you look closely, or if I can maybe even zoom in a little bit, you'll see that sometimes as I tuck a little bit of fabric a little further down, it will create a little bit of a buckle. And so your next tuck needs to be one that kind of smooths that out. That way you're not getting any pleats as you tuck your fabric down in there, because you don't want to end up with a bunch of fabric that's bunchy or looks like it's pleated on the sides. You want it to lay smoothly as possible against the foam and then tuck down into the groove and not overlap with little pleats all along your groove line. So that's a pretty good initial tuck. Now I'm going to do my trimming before I do the final tucking. I feel like sometimes the trimming is actually a little trickier than the actual tucking because if you over trim, you're going to end up with a big chunk out of the area of fabric that you need to show on the ornament. But if you don't trim close enough, then you're going to have a bunch of excess fabric that you're trying to work down into those grooves, and that can be frustrating sometimes too. So it's like many things with ornaments, it's kind of a balancing act. You have to try to find that happy medium of how much to trim versus how much to leave so that you get the result that you're wanting. You might remember when I was talking about trim that I said if you have some trim that is a little wider, it's going to be a little more forgiving because it's going to cover up some of those mistakes and the things that are going on underneath, the trim in those grooves. But I'm going to be using a really thin type of trim, so that's why I'm really trying to be very careful about my trimming and my tucking, because I don't want any of the raw edges of the fabric to show and peek out from underneath the trim when it's all said and done. I want it to really be as nice and neat as possible so that when I do place my trim on there, it's going to go on very easily, and I'm not going to be concerned about having to hide a bunch of stuff that the trim is not going to cover. So if you're like me and you're using a thinner trim, a more narrow trim, then take your time. There's no rush. That's part of the fun of making these types of ornaments, is just taking your time to get things tucked down into the grooves. It's not a race, having to take a little extra time to do the proper trimming and tucking. It will be worth it in the end. You're going to get the results that you're happy with. Now I'm here at the top and I really want to tuck this fabric down in there, but if I tuck too much, I might actually bend some of this foam that's not covered yet. So I'm going to try to push it over to the side into that center groove before I tuck it down in there, because if I just push it straight down, I'm going to end up hitting this foam on the other side, and I don't want to mess that foam up. So I'm going to move the fabric so that it kind of lays sideways before I tuck it down into the groove, and that should help so that I don't mess up the foam that I'm going to be working on later. Now here at the top, I do have a little bit of fabric that's still kind of sticking up a little bit, and I'm going to go ahead and leave that for now. I'm not going to try to get it completely perfectly tucked, because I do have 3 more pieces of fabric that need to go in there, and as I place those 3 pieces, it's probably going to help push some of that fabric on the other side down that's right there in the center at the top. And also, this might end up being the top of my pumpkin ornament anyway, so it will be covered with a bead cap. So if you have a little bit of stuff that's sticking up out of the groove right there, let's wait till the end and see how things go. That might end up being the top and we won't have to worry about it much anyway. So here at the bottom, that one is sticking up a little too much, so I'm going to go ahead and tuck that down a little more. When it's all said and done, you'll be able to look at both ends of your pumpkin and see which one looks a little nicer, and that's usually the one I opt to be the bottom of my pumpkin, because I know that I'm going to be able to cover up mistakes at the top part of my pumpkin with the bead cap and beads and pin and things like that much easier than I will at the bottom. There we go, 3 panels in place. Before we start on side 2 of the disc, I wanted to mention that the hole in that side of the disc, you shouldn't have any trouble covering that. Typically the panel that you use for the center area, it will cover it just fine. It lays on the foam fine, and you'll never actually notice that there's a hole there. If for some reason you happen to be using really light fabrics, or maybe like sort of a sheer type of fabric or something, you'll definitely want to do something like maybe use 2 layers of fabric for that particular panel, just so that you don't see that hole there. All right, let's get started. On this second side, we're going to do it the same way we did the first side, by doing the 2 side panels and then doing the center panel last. So all of our tucking is done, and it's time to place the cord or the trim around all those grooves where we tucked our fabric into. So I have here just some very narrow cord. It's about 2 or 3 millimeters wide, and it's about 28 inches long. So whatever cord you're using, one thing to pay attention to are the ends. You'll want to make sure the ends of your cord are sealed if it's a type of trim or cord that frays easily. Depending on what kind of cord or trim you have, it may not need to be sealed at all because it may not fray, but if it does, that may be something you need to add a little dab of glue at the end so that it seals it with glue, or you could tape it and then trim it a little bit so that the tape holds it together there at the end. You just don't want it coming unraveled as you work with it, and definitely don't want it unraveled on your finished ornament. So seal the ends if necessary. So we've already talked about what types of glue you can use for this. I'm going to be using this Fabri-Tac, but one thing I wanted to mention is the tip of whatever glue you're using is probably going to be a little too wide for those grooves. For instance, this one's pretty small and I might be able to get away with it, but there are some glues where the tip of your glue is really wide, and if you try to use it directly on your ornament, it's probably going to make a bit of a mess. So if you're not really confident that your tip is really small and will get down into the grooves enough, then I suggest you do something like maybe use something like a toothpick, or I've even used a pearl head pin and just used that and dipped it down into the glue and then placed it exactly in the grooves right where I want it. So that tends to be a little better as far as precision. If you need to get like a little piece of paper or maybe even like a little dish and put some glue in there and then start dipping your tool of whatever you're using into the glue and then placing it, whatever works best for you, but I highly recommend that you really pay attention to the tip of your glue. So I'm going to actually be using my pearl head pin today, and I'm just going to dip it straight down into the bottle, just right down into the glue, and then kind of squeezing my glue so that it goes up and coats part of my pin just like that. And then I'll take that and just kind of gradually wipe it right into the grooves right where I want to place it, and that way when I'm not working with it, I can just put it right back in to the top of my glue, and my glue is not going to dry out while I'm working with the cord. So that tends to be the way I like to work with it, but whatever works for you, go ahead and get started. I'm going to begin my cord here at one end, whichever end I want to be the top, because I want to be able to place my cord and run it along those grooves in such a way where I don't have to cut it. I want to begin and end in the same spot, right at the top of my pumpkin. So I think this is going to be the bottom of my pumpkin. This is going to be the top. This is where I'm going to start. So to get started, I'm actually going to lay it here right at the top so that after it's attached at the top, I will begin to bring it down this front side of my pumpkin. So I'm also going to pin it in addition to gluing it, just to give it a little extra security right there at the top. So I'm just going to put it right through the end of my cord and push it right down into the foam, pretty much, down as far as I can get it, because I really want it to be hidden down there. So now it's secure, and now I'm going to start adding glue just like I talked about with my pearl head pin, and just running my pin with the glue in that groove and working one section at a time, gluing and pressing the cord down, and then moving to the next section, gluing and pressing the cord down. All right, here we go. So I have some glue right on my pin. I'm going to start right up here and just place it right down into that groove. Just kind of wipe it a little bit so it's getting on both edges. And I don't mind working just a little at a time. If you're impatient, you might want to use a toothpick that will probably hold a little more glue, but I really like to work just really slowly so that I know that I'm getting enough glue in the right spot and it's going to hold my cord as I work along. All right, so I'm just going to continue on this side down to the bottom and then cross over onto the second side of my disc. So I reached the top here and I'm getting ready to run it around this edge, but you'll notice since I'm changing directions, it seems like this part of my cord, it might want to try to pop up and over. So since it's changing directions, I'm going to go ahead and use a second pin here, just like I did at the top. I'm going to use another one here at the top again, just to hold that, but you want to make sure that you place it in a spot where it's going to be hidden later. If it's sticking out on the side, then it's going to be noticeable when your ornament is done. So I'm placing it right down there in the groove, pretty deep. And now it's going to hold it right where it's changing direction. And now I can continue just working my way all around the edge. And when I reach the top once again, I will go ahead and finish these last two grooves here on both sides of my ornament. All right, I've arrived at the top again, and once again I'm going to be changing directions to come down this front side of the pumpkin. So I'm going to place one more pin down deep into the groove before I begin changing directions and coming down this side. All right, so here we are at the very top, and I'm going to snip off this little excess of the cord that I don't need, being careful to give myself just enough extra so that I can tuck it down into the groove when I'm done, and then add a little glue on top so that it doesn't come unraveled. All right, so I'm going to add a little glue right in this area where I know it's going to be tucked. And I have my tucking tool once again, so I'm just going to use my tucking tool to get it down in the groove. All right, so I've got that cord tucked down in there. This area looks just a little messy because it does have a couple pinheads showing, but all that's going to be covered because we're going to put a bow and a topper on top in order to create the top of our pumpkin. But the bottom part, you'll notice, is just crisscrossing cord, and it looks beautiful. All right, here we are ready for the finishing touches. So I'm going to first add a bow because I wanted it to look like there were some leaves on my pumpkin. So I'm going to add that first. You certainly don't have to add any kind of bow if you don't want to. Several of my examples earlier did not have any kind of, bow or leaf type things, just the tendrils and the stem. So whatever works for you. This time I wanted a bow. I think it's so cute. So now I'm going to add some things on top. So I'm taking a pin here with a little loop. This is from the Ornament Girl Supply Shop because I want to hang this one. So before I place beads and things like that on there, I'm first going to take some floral wire that I have, and I want to create some tendrils with it. So first things first, I'm going to just wrap it around once around that pin. And now I have a spot where I can slide the pin through there later. But I don't need the pin right now because what I want to do now is take something that I can wrap this around in order to create that coil. So I'm going to take just this paintbrush that I happen to have, and I'm going to start at one end, and I'm just going to begin to wrap it around. You could use a pencil, you could use, anything small that you have, depending on what size of tendrils you want to create. So I'm just rolling it up. And when I get to the end there, right to that point where my pin was, I'm going to pull it out, and now I've created a nice cute little coil, a tendril for my pumpkin on one side. This is the center where the pin's going to go later. So now I need to do this other side. So I'm going to start here once again at the end and start wrapping it around and rolling it up. And when I get to the middle, I'll slide it out, and now I have my tendril created. I can manipulate it more later, but for now it's done. And so I'm going to start stacking things here on my pin, starting with whatever beads I want to have. So at the top, I want to have this stardust gold bead. And then I have another bead here, an acrylic bead. And then I'm going to place a bead cap. And I want that bead cap facing down because that is going to cover the top here of my bow. That pin that's holding the bow, I wanted something to cover that because it's silver, and I wanted to have something that was more of an antique bronze type of color and give it a little more height here on the stem as well. So I have all of those things stacked, and now I'm going to take that tendril that I created and that little loop that I made in the middle for my pin. I'm going to place that right back onto the pin. And now that whole stack of stuff, I'm going to stick it right down into my pumpkin through the bow. As you insert your pin down into your disc, make sure that you're going straight down into the disc. You don't want it to poke out either side. So I'm just going to press mine straight down through the bow. And there we go. So now I have a little loop on top, and I'm actually going to be hanging this one. So I have a little hook here for Christmas ornament. It's now going to be a Halloween ornament. And my pumpkin is all ready to hang. Well, I sure hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you make yourself a whole patch filled with patchwork pumpkins. Please be sure to subscribe to the Ornament Girl YouTube channel if you haven't already. You'll get a lot more tips and ideas and ornament inspiration. Happy ornamenting. Bye.